The third key I want to suggest to you is yes to mission and no to spiritual worldliness. Spiritual worldliness is an expression I had never come across before I started to read and hear the Pope. I don't know whether you had. It's a really common theme, as you'll see throughout my book, throughout The Great Reformer. From the very beginning, Francis is quoting Henri de Lubac, a Jesuit theologian, from a book in the 1950s called Méditation sur l'Église. De Lubac says there that spiritual worldliness is the most insidious temptation for religious people, the worst evil that can befall the church. It's really strong language. And Francis Bergoglio, throughout his life as a Jesuit and then as bishop and as cardinal and now as pope, has constantly reiterated this warning. It's there in Evangelii Gaudium. There are many pages on the dangers of spiritual worldliness. The warning against it was at the heart, actually, of the speech that he made to the cardinals on the eve of the conclave, in which he contrasted, on the one hand, a self-referential worldly church, living off its own light rather than the light of Christ, with, on the other, a church that lives from evangelizing, that's geared to the peripheries, that is geared to mission, that is focused on the needs of the poor. And having presented this choice, he then said to the cardinals, this should give rise to the possible changes and reforms that ought to be made for the salvation of souls. So there you have the Congarian aim of reform is pastoral. And there in the conclave, or just before the conclave, he's laying out the whole program. What is spiritual worldliness, and why is it such an obsession for Francis? Spiritual worldliness is the use of religion or faith to advance our own interests or the interests of other people, or any worldly interests that are not the interests of Christ's. And it's why Francis is so opposed to and so angry with, impatient with, if you like, certain courtly ways and traditions of the Vatican, because they're left over from the Vatican's days as a Baroque court. Now, the media often get this wrong by portraying Francis as a kind of pauperist pope, somebody who always rejects pomp and luxury in favor of what is poor. And as you know, it's become part of the embedded narrative that Francis refused to live in the apostolic palace and went to live in the Santa Marta because the apostolic palace was in some way luxurious. Well, I can tell you, having stayed in the Santa Marta, that it's no hovel. I would say... I wouldn't dare to obviously compare this great hotel with the Casa Santa Marta, but put it that way, I'd rather be in the Santa Marta. It's lined with marble, as you can see there. It's an extremely comfortable place. No, what he rejects is not wealth, but the temptation of worldliness, the trading of spiritual goods. It's very hard now, as any cardinal will tell you in some frustration, to arrange a meeting with the Pope as a reward for somebody who has donated to the church. Francis isn't interested in that. If you want to donate to the church, donate to the church. If you want to meet the Pope, but don't mix the two things up. Now, this was he's particularly sensitive to ideas and views which are marketed as gospel values, which are really covers for worldly ideologies or interests. In a meeting with the Latin American bishops in July 2013 in Rio, he talked about a temptation which has existed in the church from the very beginning, to interpret the gospel apart from the gospel itself. This was the argument he had with progressive Jesuits in the 1970s, who tried to turn the church into an instrument of political struggle for social justice. Note how in the bull Misericordiae Vultus, he refers to the temptation to focus exclusively on justice. It's the argument that he will certainly have when he's here, is already having with some American conservatives who will tend to view the church as, if you like, an army in the service of a wider cultural battle, and should therefore stay out of issues like ecology or immigration or wealth creation. So the discernment of gospel versus worldly interests is at the heart of what he is as a pope and what he always was as a Jesuit. And a key model and inspiration for him were the reductions, the Jesuit missions in Paraguay of the 17th and 18th centuries in South America, which were distinctive in the Spanish colony, precisely because they were focused entirely on the needs of the people. They were not confused, if you like, with Spanish colonial interests. For Francis, freedom from spiritual worldliness is necessary for mission. And his aim, as Evangelii Gaudium makes clear on virtually every page, is a church geared to mission. And it's worth reading those pages in Evangelii Gaudium to warn against all the temptations of spiritual worldliness, which we're all faced with, to understand how intrinsically linked these two ideas are in his mind. Francis seeks a missionary church, which is essentially, to use a theologian's word, kerygmatic, which focuses on the proclamation of the love of God. The church exists for one purpose, which is to continue Jesus' mission of making known God's love and healing power, not just in words, but in concrete actions as well. Jesus, sent by God, entrusts his mission to the church, which exists for no other purpose than the service of humanity, above all those who are on the margins. That's why Francis says he wants priests who smell of sheep and not the sacristy, because he wants priests who actually know what the needs of people are. Mission implies action, proclamation, but also a constant purifying. What does not serve the purpose of the mission, what causes the church to focus on itself or the world, or rather than on Christ, must be named and shamed. When Francis is tough on his clergy, and believe me, he's tougher than any previous pope on the church itself. He's hard on Vatican personnel, he's hard on bishops, he's hard on priests. But that's why, because he's spotted spiritual worldliness and he's trying to purge it because he believes it's the one thing which distracts from mission. So when people ask, is this pope a liberal or a conservative? Is he a progressive or a traditionalist? The answer should be, he's a gospel radical who is determined to purify the church for the purpose of mission, who will resolutely oppose any effort to use evangelization in any other cause. And finally, you've done very well. Communication as parousia. One of the surprising stories to emerge from my book, The Great Reformer, is how after 2005-2006, Cardinal Bergoglio became very close to Catholic charismatics in Buenos Aires, and through them he began meeting with evangelical pastors with whom he prayed every month. From about 2006, every month he used to meet to pray with them in the charismatic style. I note in the book a growth in him from that time of what he would call parousia, which can be roughly translated as apostolic courage. It's the gift of the Spirit which gives you the courage to speak fearlessly what needs to be said. It's a word that embraces not being afraid to say what has to be said. It's the gift that's given by the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, when you remember the apostles were cowed, fearful in the upper room, but as a result of the experience of the Spirit, were then able to address whole great crowds and indeed experience hostility and martyrdom and the rest of it. Now, Francis was given this gift in a very dramatic way. Obviously, before becoming Pope, he had that gift. I show in the book how he was utterly fearless as Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires in confronting interests, in confronting mafias and the government and so on. But he experienced the gift in another way, or in a further way, on the night of his election. Although Cardinal Bergoglio was hardly afraid to speak out in Buenos Aires, he was actually known for being aloof and distant, reluctant to give interviews, and sometimes quite enigmatic in his way of speaking. But the night of his election, he had an experience of the Spirit which has changed him. And he has spoken about it a number of times. An experience in prayer of light and of freedom, he says, which has never left him. A large part of what we now think of as the new style of papal communication, unfenced, spontaneous, frank and fearless, is due to this charismatic docility of his. He's not an extrovert, as many people think, but is actually a profoundly introverted person. And you'll see that from the book. What's happening is he's an introvert who's been given the gift of parousia. I know many, many people who worked with him very closely in Buenos Aires, and they all comment on this shift in him, this change in him, this gift that he's been given. Now, a communication which is based on parousia is, of course, tough going, particularly on the Vatican press office, which is usually the last to know when he's given an interview. And it means, of course, abandoning the stasis of a pope sitting and reading from a vetted document prepared for him by the Secretariat of State, which is given out under embargo to the journalist beforehand. It's not like that anymore. He will usually start to read from the script, abandon it, then suddenly speak in Spanish, which then requires a translator on hand. And, of course, it's all become much more exciting, but, if you like, from a communications point of view, much more unpredictable. It's tough, of course, on the spokesman and the translation, and also tough on communications people who often, as the bishop was saying earlier, have to account for or explain what has been portrayed in the media. But what an extraordinary transformation this spontaneous communication has brought about. For Francis, it is more important to speak the truth than to avoid offense. He is, in fact, a deeply offensive pope. He causes a lot of offense. He doesn't pander to people's often feelings and considerations. He will speak the truth he believes he has to speak. And when he does so, he paints in vivid colours, in language of great simplicity and directness. He's free from message discipline. He speaks straight to the heart. And in doing so, is giving new life to church teaching by injecting it with relevance and immediacy. And resurrecting, I want to suggest, in the Western world, a memory of a love they once knew, a tender God who sacrificed himself to save the least deserving among us. When Francis speaks, the world listens, without changing a single church doctrine or diluting any element of church teaching. He has made it all new and urgent. It's fascinating, though, to watch the media grapple, and many of our commentators grapple with this dilemma. How is it that a pope can be so popular? How can he have reached out beyond the church and appealed to people of other religions and atheists and people who are traditionally hostile to the church when he hasn't changed church teaching? And this dilemma you could see Time magazine grappling with when they made him Person of the Year at the end of 2013. And of course Time magazine, wrestling with this dilemma, were forced to conclude by its own logic that he was some kind of PR genius. But that's exactly what he isn't. It's actually his integrity, his total honesty, and his complete transparency which transfix the world and transfix the media. Francis is, the best way of understanding him in many ways, is a pope of process. He's not in charge of the church. He believes that Christ is in charge of the church, and his own role is to initiate processes which allow the Holy Spirit to flow more freely and more easily through the church. And what he has created in the Synod is a protected space in which he believes the Holy Spirit can act. If people speak frankly and listen humbly and we give time to the process, the Holy Spirit will act as it did in the early councils of the church, because the Holy Spirit is blocked where there is fear and dishonesty and a refusal to listen. But where there is basic faith in the church's doctrine and time is given and freedom is given, the Holy Spirit will be allowed to act. Francis, therefore, is a charismatic Jesuit, initiating processes that he believes will allow the church to grow and to develop by clearing the channels that allow the Holy Spirit to flow again. And it's why he particularly loves the devotion of Mary Untire of Knots, Maria Desata Nudos. He sees himself too as a kind of unblocker, a builder of relationships that allow the Holy Spirit to flow across the bridges which he builds. And that's why from the Synod Hall to Cuba, from St. Peter's Square to the Middle East, from the homeless in Rome to the typhoon victims in the Philippines, from Oscar Romero to the US Congress now in September, his is a restless papacy in permanent motion, untying knots, removing blockages, revivifying the way the church presents itself to the world, and leading a culture change in the church, which of course the jury is still out on whether it will succeed in changing us all. But I suggest that what he has done so far, the way he has reset the papacy, the reforms that he has put in place, will lead to him being seen, have already led to him being seen as one of the great reformers in the modern church. Thank you very much.
We do have about 10 minutes for a Q&A. Sorry, guys. We have about 10 minutes for a Q&A. So we've got mic runners in the back of the room. If anybody wants to stand up, we can bring a mic to you, and we can get a couple questions in.
Thank you so much for all of your words. Very insightful. Now, just last week, I met a woman. She had been Catholic all of her life. And when I asked her about Pope Francis, you could see she was visibly unsettled. You know, she was uncomfortable. She wasn't sure where he was going with the church. And in some ways, she felt that the church that she knew from her youth was crumbling. Now, what would you say to her, or what advice can we give her or people like her to make them feel more comfortable with the Pope that we have today?
Thank you very much. Well, obviously she should buy the book. But I would also say to her, you know, what I've said in this talk, he is a Catholic that's deeply rooted in church traditions and has been all his life. And that if she's disturbed by what he says, she should assume that if it appears to contradict something that the church believes, then it's probably because it's been some way misinterpreted or spun along the way. And this is, of course, the major challenge we all have. By the time something the Pope has said spontaneously has been translated, often badly, into English, picked up by the news wires, you know how it works, 24-hour news culture. By the time it appears as a headline, it can really be a very long way from what he originally said. And this, of course, is the price that you pay for having a Pope who's at the heart of the media, who's the media are paying close attention to. But I would say it's a price well worth paying, as long as we, the church, are willing to step up to the plate, particularly those of us engaged in communication, because it's our role, when we read one of those headlines, go and find out what he actually said, read the transcript, and help our ordinary parishioners and help people to understand the Pope better. I mean, here in Brooklyn, you've just got this extraordinary communications activities. I'm just so impressed coming from the other side of the pond. We don't have anything like it. Your TV channels, your newspapers, your radios, your satellite programs, it's really extraordinary the amount of a capacity you have for communication and clarifying. And I would say, and I know you do, use that, because we have at the moment a papacy which requires a lot of interpreting. But the hermeneutic, the key should always be assume that Francis has not departed from church teaching, because he never does. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. Changing just the perspective a little bit, Francis is the traditional Jesuit, but in today's world, especially from a communication standpoint, there's a huge gap between what I, as an old retired guy now, and my 5 millennial children, and how they look at communications, how they interact, everything about them, they don't even know where their checkbooks are anymore, has changed. How do we see this Pope being able to bridge that gap that so many of us older people have a real hard time understanding the real communications gap between, where we perceive things are and where the young people really are?
Well, the church needs to be present in all the means of communication that ordinary people are using in any different age. And I think we have here a Pope who's been phenomenally successful in that. This is the Pope who inaugurated the first papal selfie, which has now become a standard of almost any encounter with the Pope. He's also the most widely retweeted person in the world, which makes him the most influential person on Twitter. The joke, of course, here is that he actually he doesn't know how to use a smartphone or a computer. In fact, I say in the book, he sent one of his the people who used to work for him in Buenos Aires, sent him on a course to learn about social media. And Federico says that, he half got it, and he would say, after he'd given a homily, he'd say, Federico, make sure you put my homily up on that 140 character thing, he would say. But in fact, as he confessed, when he was in a Google Hangout with a number of disabled children. I don't know whether you saw this. It was rather moving. And this disabled girl of about 12 asked him very sweetly, does he download pictures, on his from his Google Docs? So it was some quite complicated technical question. And the Pope said, look, I have to confess, I'm completely useless with any technology. So he personally is completely useless with technology, but his communication is being transmitted through social media. And that's important. We need to provide, those people who know about social media need to be able to provide that support to our church leaders to enable that to happen. But as for speaking for young people in general, I've noticed actually young people get Francis in a way often that older people don't. And that's always been true in his life. The younger Jesuits were the ones who always related to him much more naturally than the older ones. And I think because they sense in him that he isn't actually bound by tradition, that he respects tradition, but he's not bound by it, and that there's a kind of a playfulness and a mischievousness in him, which is very characteristic of young people. I think actually this Pope offers a tremendous opportunity for speaking to young people in a way that often the Church hasn't. Thank you.
Oh, hi, Dr. Ivereigh. I'd just like to thank you for this wonderful book.
Where are you?
Which was given. Oh, I'd like to thank you for this wonderful
hi.
book, which was given to me while I was going away.
Oh.
And I said, I'm not going to read it. Okay, but I started reading it and I couldn't put it down.
Ah.
I was on a cruise and it's really wonderful. It gave
Thank
me a
you.
lot of insight into what Pope Francis is saying and all the dialogue, and the research is really awesome. I brought my book with me and hope you will sign it for me.
Delighted.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, is that all you wanted to say? Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. By the way, you people think sometimes writers, hear this all the time and they don't need to hear it. Not true. Please tell us.
So for the sake of time, we've got time for one more question. We're going to take one from the front, and then we're going to get right into our Vatican Insiders panel.
Pope Francis follows two papacies, which were probably most traditional in modern time. It seems like we're getting back to, God is love, and that message is being received worldwide. Is he professing Catholicism, or is he going beyond Catholicism? Is he teaching God is love to all faiths, to all people, to persons of different color, different persuasions, and how important is that? And quite frankly, I'm not clear that he would have had success if we didn't have true traditional popes prior to him. I don't see him coming out with very deep encyclicals that theologians will be reading for decades before they could be interpreted. Your thoughts?
Yeah, this of course is something that people discuss a lot. To what extent is Francis a break with the papacies which preceded him? I think you'll see from the book that he certainly wouldn't view it that way, and that in 2005 he was very much in favor, for example, of Benedict becoming Pope. He was convinced that the Pope in 2005 should be Benedict. And indeed in the book, one of the dramas in the later chapters is the way that Benedict himself seemed to discern that the European Church was, in Ignatian terms, entering into a period of desolation, and the Latin American Church, the opposite, of consolation, showing signs of immense spiritual vigor, joy, missionary impulse and energy, which became particularly obvious after a parecida when the Latin American bishops met in Brazil. And Benedict was there, you see. And, I take a little bit of a liberty in the book, but I see the moment that Benedict chose to stand down, a decision he took, incidentally, having hit his head on a basin in a bathroom in a hotel in Leon, Mexico, in March 2012. And I think there's something deeply moving about this, the frail, if you like, elderly German Pope choosing to stand down a year later. He then made the plans to do so, knowing that he would be making way, if you like, for a new source church. So I think I would rather see that each papacy, the Holy Spirit, I don't think it's pat to say the Holy Spirit gives the church the Pope that it needs for the time. And I think John Paul II's immense pontificate had a purpose of unifying the church after a debilitating period of internal discussion and argument within the church following the Second Vatican Council. The priority was to restore the unity of the church, if you like, and to have an interpretation of Vatican II that could be agreed by everybody. So necessarily it was a more centralist and authoritarian kind of papacy. And indeed, I've been told, yes, you couldn't have had Francis without John Paul II and Benedict before him. The other thing I would say is that, it's quite fascinating. Francis quotes Benedict a lot, sometimes literally quotes him, but sometimes just simply uses an expression, which was very much Benedict's expression. And I think in many ways, just like St. Francis of Assisi took, St. Benedict, what, as Chesterton said of St. Francis of Assisi, what St. Benedict stored, St. Francis scattered. And I think in many ways we can see Francis as taking out onto the street, the teachings that Benedict had developed. So I see them in essential continuity, even though, of course, they are dramatically different papacies.